Hi everyone, so my name is Emily Putz. I'm a habitat stewardship coordinator with Nature Saskatchewan's Rare Plant Rescue Program, and I'm here today to present on general plant ID, some tricks and tips and the basic terms that you'll see if you're just getting into IDing our prairie plants. So if you're just starting out, opening up a field guide can be a little daunting because you might see a paragraph like this and under any one plant species. It's very technical, very word heavy, and you're just not sure where to start. So in this presentation, I'm going to give a quick overview of some of those terms. I'm not going to get into it too much, but just to give you a quick overview of what some of the terms might mean as a good starting point. And I'm going to give you some tricks and tips of things that you want to keep in mind while you're starting your IDing journey. So some of these terms, it's really helpful if you're looking for a specific plant because you can arm yourself with a few characteristics, know what they mean in the guide, know what to look for, and it really takes the guesswork out right off the bat. So you know what you're looking for, you can eliminate species from your search. Another helpful thing to have with you, if you can fit in your field pack, is a glossary like this one. Many of you might have seen this book before. I always have in my field pack. It's skinny enough to do so. And it is a glossary of all the terms you might see if you're looking at an ID key. And the really helpful thing about it as well is it comes with pictures. And nobody expects you to know every single term. So having that glossary with you, you can pull it out as you're IDing, know exactly what that term means, and that can help you right away. So it might seem basic, but if you're just starting to ID, one of the first things you should ask yourself is, what I'm looking at, is it a woody plant or a herbaceous plant? So woody plants are things like trees and shrubs, while herbaceous plants are things like grasses or forbs. They're also called herbs. Forbs are things like the wildflowers you might see on the prairies. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but a tree, what is a tree? So a tree has secondary growth. So if you're thinking of a tree ring, for example, that's a single stem has growth year after year, adding to the diameter of the stem. Trees typically are fairly tall, over 3 meters at maturity, and they typically have one single stem. In a mature tree, that would be the trunk, right? A shrub, shrubs are sometimes trickier to ID because they come in all shapes and sizes. They also have secondary growth on their stems. They're usually less tall, so usually below 3 meters at maturity. And they have multiple stems coming out from their base. And like I mentioned, they can come in all shapes and sizes. For example, in the rightmost picture there, that's juniper. It's a shrub too. It might not get very tall, but it has that woody secondary growth. So keep that in mind if you're IDing. Now, what I'll spend most of my time on is the forbs and the different characteristics of forbs. So forbs are herbaceous plants that are not a tree, shrub, or grass. I'll get into grasses in a little bit here. Forbs can complete their life cycle in a number of years, so perennials, 1 year, annual, or biennials, which means they complete their life cycle in 2 years. So that's something that might have a basal rosette 1 year and then get their flowering stalk the second year. They have no secondary growth. So their stems die back every year. And these are what we consider the flowering plants. So if you hear somebody talking about the flowering plants, they're talking about a forb. Now, grasses and grass-like plants, that include sedges, rushes, and the typical grasses. They're monocots, which I'll explain what that means in a minute here. And they generally have linear leaves, so long and thin. So think of a blade of grass that you might find in your backyard, those long, thin leaves. They have flowers as well, but they differ a little bit from the typical flowers of forbs. So I'll get into grass flowers in a little bit and the parts of them. Before that though, I just want to step back a little bit and explain the difference between a monocot and a dicot. So you might have heard me mention that grasses are considered monocots. So what this means, it's two different types of plants here. And they get their names from the seed leaves. When the seed's first germinating, they get the little baby leaves sticking out. Monocots have one, as their name suggests, and dicots have two. And this can be really helpful if you're IDing plants to be able to differentiate the two, because you can split it right away up into a family, and then you can get down to the species that way. So monocots, and once you know the differences between the two, it's fairly simple to tell them apart. So monocots, their flowering parts usually come in multiples of 3. So for example, there's a picture of a lily there, which is monocot, and you can see it has 3 petals and 3 sepals. Their leaves generally have parallel venation. So I mentioned a blade of grass earlier. So if you've ever pulled a blade of grass apart, the veins run parallel to each other in that leaf. Whereas dicots, their flower parts generally come in multiples of 4s and 5s, and their veins in their leaves are more of a network. So they can be branching, they can look a whole lot of different ways, but they don't have that nice parallel venation. They're kind of doing their own thing. So some types of monocots, I mentioned lilies earlier, so anything in the lily family, irises, or grasses. And it's helpful to know if something's a monocot from first glance. For example, Rare Plant Rescue, the program I work for, one of our target species is Western spiderwort. And actually the leftmost pictures there are all of Western spiderwort, and it's a monocot. So if you can train your eyes to look for the differences between the dicots and the monocots, as you're walking along, you can pull something out of your mind, say, oh, that's a monocot, oh, it's not a grass, maybe I should take a closer look at that. And it helps you develop a search image for what you're looking for. Now, dicots, they actually encompass 70% of all flowering plants. So this is basically everything else that you'll come across that is not a monocot. So this includes things like asters, violets, anything in the mustard family. Basically, you name it, if it's not a monocot, it's a dicot. And you can see there the branching network of veins in the leaves. Now, to switch gears a little bit, we're going to talk about growth habit now. So if you're looking at a species description, one of the things they'll mention is growth habit. So I have a few terms here, and they're and to get into them a little bit here. So bunched, especially if you're talking about grass species, it might talk about a bunch grass. So you can see the topmost pictures there. All the growth is coming out from a single location in a big bunch, like the name suggests. You can have creeping growth. So that can be underground runners called rhizomes. They can shoot out kind of an underground root, and then a new plant can pop up a few centimeters away. And that's how plants can spread in like a carpet across the ground. Or a kind of opposite of that, you can have a runner above the ground, which is called a stolon. So a lot of grass species do that, but also other plants such as strawberries. So if you're thinking strawberries, they'll have stolons, and that they'll spread and run a stem over the ground and then root themselves a few centimeters away, and a new plant will grow from there. Growth form is also important to keep in mind. So you can have a erect plant that grows standing straight up. And this picture right here, if you can see my mouse, that's a great example of that. Twining or climbing, that's something like a vine, a decumbent. So that's reclining. So it grows along the ground, but its flowering stems are usually ascend a bit. So the bottom picture here, that's of a decumbent plant, and you can see the flowering stems, the flowers are pointed up. Or you could have prostrate, and that's right flat against the ground. So the juniper here again, that grows right flat against the ground. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the parts of a plant. These are important terms to know. So a culm is another word for the stem. Flowers, they can also be called florets. And when you have a bunch of florets together, that's called an inflorescence. Now, inflorescence is a really important term to know because a lot of times when you're describing a flower, you're actually describing the inflorescence. So if you think of something like a sunflower even in the aster family, that's actually an inflorescence made up of a whole bunch of florets, mini tiny flowers. All right. Continuing on with the parts of the plant here. So these pictures are just showing you a grass on the right and a different flowering plant on the left. And it's showing you some of those terms and how would they would look on those different plants. So leaves, obviously, the blade of grass, it's a monocot, so it has that long parallel venation in there. Whereas the plant on the left, that's a dicot. The culm, the stem on either side here, and then the floret. So the floret in the inflorescence, so on the left there, those two flowers would make up the inflorescence, and each of the smaller flowers would be a floret. Whereas the grass, we'll get into it in a little bit here, but the florets are contained within a spike or a spikelet. And you can see on this picture here, if I can get my mouse there, this would be the inflorescence. Okay, which is made up of several spikelets in this case, and each spikelet is made up of a series of florets, which contain the flowers of the grass. Moving down the plant, leaf arrangement, that is a really, really good one to know. And it's a simple one to keep in your mind, and it really helps differentiate a lot of lookalikes in the field if you're looking for a specific plant. So plant leaves, this is simply how the leaves come off of the stem. So they can be alternate, where one leaf comes off and then further up on the stem, the other leaf comes off, and they kind of trade sides. Opposite, where two leaves come off the stem in the same location going up, or world where the leaves come off the stem in the same spot, but kind of whirled right around the stem. And the reason I say this is an important one to know is that it's a really good way to be able to differentiate lookalikes in the field. For example, one of RPR's, Rare Plant Rescue's target plants is sand verbena here. So that's the leftmost picture. And one of the lookalikes, the picture in the middle, is sand dock. And they superficially look quite similar, but sand verbena has opposite leaves. So if you're looking at sand verbena and the leaves are coming off opposite of the stem, you're like, oh, maybe I should take a closer look. Whereas if the leaves are coming off alternate, well, you can say, oh, that's likely sand dock and move on. Now, leaf arrangements continuing. So I mentioned earlier biennials, and often biennials will have a basal rosette in their first year. So this is a number of leaves coming right from the ground, and the flowering stalk usually emerges from that basal rosette. So leaf attachment, you can have a sessile leaf. So the leaf is attached directly to the plant stem, or you can have a leaf with its own little stalk, a petiole, and that's what attaches it to the plant stem. Leaf shapes, so simple leaves, they're also called entire, and this this is one leaf. So a good example of this is if you're thinking of a typical tree leaf, that's one leaf coming off the stem, whereas opposed to a compound leaf, which can be made up of smaller leaflets. So there's an example right there. You can see that the leaf is contained, there's, what is that, 7 leaflets in that case. So for simple entire leaves, you can have different shapes. Now, if you have a glossary, an illustrated glossary, it might have something like this in the back, which is a really great shortcut for you. And usually when you're seeing a species, it'll have a description of what the leaf shape looks like. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's really good to know, and you can kind of make up tricks and tips for yourself. So for example, cordate, that's heart-shaped, whereas reniformed is kidney-shaped. Okay, so this is going into compound leaves. So those are leaves that might be a little more complicated than the entire simple leaves that we saw on the slide before. Again, I'm not going to go into all of these, but it's helpful to know. Now, leaf margins. So this is a good one to know. So this picture here is really good. So the leaf margins of a leaf can look different ways, and this can help you idea plant. So you can have kind of a toothed leaf that's serrate, or you can have an entire smooth leaf that doesn't have any little bumps along the margin. Leaf venation, I went into this a little bit already. Okay, so leaf surfaces. This can be a very important one to remember. So for example, smooth goosefoot, another plant species that we target in my program, as its name suggests, is smooth. So that's glabrous, it's the first term up there. That's smooth without hairs or glands if you run your finger along the surface of the leaf. Whereas opposed, some of its trickiest and closest lookalikes have a mealy coating on their leaf. And if you rub your finger, that meal kind of comes off, and you can say, oh, right away, it's a meal. It might not be what I'm looking for. Another example of this is another one of our targets, hairy prairie clover. So that plant is densely pubescent. So it has tons of tiny, tiny little hairs all along the stems and the leaves. And you can feel those as you run your finger across the leaf surface or the stem surface. Opposed to purple prairie clover, which is one of its lookalikes, which is not nearly as pubescent. So these are really important ones to know, and they're really simple ones to know. You don't even have to kind of keep the term in mind, but as long as you're thinking about, oh, this plant is got little hairs, it's smooth, or it's kind of mealy, or feels kind of gritty if I run my finger across it, things like that. So this page is just going into some of the different hair types that you can see on the plant, and your guide will go into it too. So sometimes hairs are a little bit pokey, and you can feel that as you run your finger across them. They're kind of pokey, and the guide will explain that. So an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, so now I'm going to go into some of the parts of the flower. These are terms you might have heard before, and I think I've mentioned them even earlier in this presentation. So if you're looking at a flower, so the bloom of the plant, you'll see petals, but you'll also, if you flip the flowering head over, you might see sepals. So often in Dicots, these are kind of little green mini petals, if you will, at the bottom of the plant. Whereas in monocots, they can often sometimes look quite similar to the petals. So if you're thinking of a lily, you might say, oh, it's got 6 petals. actually it's got 3 upper true petals and then 3 lower sepals that just look similar to the petals. Also, you'll have the reproductive structures of the plant. So the pistil, that's the part that comes in the middle here of this picture, if I can just get my mouse on there. So that is the female structure of the plant. And then you've got the stamens, which are the male structure of the plant that has the pollen. Flower types, this is another important one to know. So once you become more familiar with the different families of the plants, you start becoming more familiar with the flower shape that that family is known for. So eventually you can say, oh, that's a pea-shaped flower. Oh, that flower is a little more bell-shaped. It might belong to this family. Things like that. Now, I mentioned inflorescences earlier. So those are the how the growth form of the mini florets, so the tinier flowers, come together. And like everything, they have different names for the different growth habits of the inflorescence. So you can have a spike, like the upper left picture here, where all the little florets are coming off right against the flowering stem there. Or you could have an umbel. So I like to think of this as an umbrella. All the flowers are coming off from a central point upwards. Now, if you miss the plant's blooming window, not all's lost. You can ID a plant often by their fruits. So you want to make sure you know what the plant looks like in seed as well. This can also be extremely handy within a family to narrow down to the species. For example, Slender-mouthed ear cress, it has white flowers, but so do a number of its lookalikes. So if you time your searches a little later, when you might see the pods or when the plant's in seed, you can know that it creates a long pod that's always held at a 45-degree angle, and none of its lookalikes do. So that can really help you narrow down the species as well. So you can have fleshy or dry fruits, things that are aggregate, like a berry, if you're they're made up of multiple little seeds, or you could have kind of a pod like the ones at the bottom in the dry fruits. Okay, so I said earlier that I'd go further into the parts of the grass. So that's what I'm going to do now. These terms are really helpful if you're getting right into grass ID. I suggest that if you're doing grass ID, though, you really read up on these terms in more detail. So parts of a grass leaf, you'll have the sheath. That's the part of the leaf that holds the leaf to the stem. So if you've ever peeled back blades of grass, you'll notice that the blade kind of pulls off the stem. So the part that wraps around the stem is the sheath. A ligule, so if you think ligule, it means like tongue. That's a membrane-like tissue that comes up from the sheath on the inside. That's very important. And it's usually like a clear membrane of where the leaf attaches to the stem. Auricles, so that word means the little ears. So these are small appendages that extend out and sometimes around the stem. They can clasp the stem right at the junction of the blade to the sheath. And I'll have pictures in a minute here to kind of illustrate these terms a little more. And then collar, that's the last one. So that's the area in between the leaf blade and the sheath. So auricles and ligules are on the inside of this area. So this diagram here just goes into that in a little more detail. So ligules, you can see, so this is if you pulled the blade of the grass back, that's the blade up here. That's where it would connect, the sheath would go around the stem. And the ligule is this little tongue-like structure that pops up there. So it can look a number of different ways. So it can kind of look like a little membrane. It can be shaped differently. It can be a little bit hairy, or it can not be there at all. And your guide will tell you that. So if you're going through an ID key, this is really important to note these terms and look for them on your blade of grass. Auricles, those are little ears that come out of the sides, and they can be claw-like and clasp, or they can be short and stubby, or they cannot be there at all. Likewise, the color here, so that's the region that you can see that the ligule and auricles might be a part of. Here's just a little more detail on actual pieces of, or species of grass. So you can see the ligule there, the auricles on the far right one, you can see they're kind of clasping. All right, so just to finish off this presentation, I'm now going to get into a bit of details on what to do when you found a species. So important things to note. So it's always important to take notes, especially if you're looking for a specific species and you're not positive on the ID. It's really important to take really thorough, really comprehensive and complete notes. What kind of soil is it growing in? What kind of other plants are growing around it? What area of the province you're in? Things like that. Also, take lots of pictures, and you always want to include something to scale. So if you just have a picture of a plant, sometimes it can be a little tricky to actually realize how big that plant is, and you need to know that if you're going to be continuing your ID out of the field. Now, it's always helpful, of course, if you have a ruler in your pack that you can just pop down beside. If you do not, you can use basically anything around you that you know the size of, or you can take with you. So your camera lens, your GPS, even a pencil, anything like that, put your finger beside it, just to get a scale of what you're looking at. Backgrounds, you're going to want to separate out the plants. So this is two pictures of the same plant actually, and it's just showing you how hard it is to actually see the plants and the different parts of the plant here with all the background grass around it. Whereas this plant, if you put even your plant leg down behind it, you can get a nice clear background. And you're going to want to take pictures of all the parts and all the parts of the plant that we just talked about in this presentation. So the inflorescence, or the fruit if it's got pods out, the individual flowers of the inflorescence. If it's got basal leaves, take pictures of the basal leaves and the stem leaves, because they can often be different from each other. If it's hairy, try and get a close-up picture of those hairs and what the stem looks like to get a little bit of the growth habit. Also, make sure you take a picture of the habitat, and a good tip is to get a picture of the macro habitat, so the surrounding area, looking outwards in the pasture or wherever you're IDing, as well as the micro habitat, so the surrounding plant community around the plants that you're looking at. Okay, so this part we're just going to go through quickly, but I just kind of want to show off some of those terms in IDing here. So this is hairy prairie clover, and if you're looking at it, some of the things you might pop out in your brain is it's the leaves. They're alternate up the stem. They're compounds. They're made up of a number of leaflets. You can count those leaflets to get an average. It's growing in sandy soil. Its stem is erect and it kind of has a reddish tinge. So you do want to be careful with color, because color can be a tricky one and it can change between individuals of any species. And the leaves, they're densely hairy, the stem's densely hairy. You want to get pictures of that. So we'll just go through here. So this is a grass species. So you can tell it's a monocot. It has that parallel venation. If you pull the blade back from the stem a bit, you can see that it's got a ligule present. You can try and measure that. It's got wide leaves, measure the width of the leaves, and you can see there's tufts of hair at the auricles, so make sure that you're picking out that when you're IDing. So if you're looking at this plant, it's another monocot. It has parallel leaves, parallel veins on its leaves. Its growth habit is erect. It's got no auricles, no ligule, no sheathing, and that's because it's Western spiderwort, so it's not a grass. So it won't have any of those characteristics, and that's important to know and to note. And then this plant, so this is a woody plant. So right away you can see that it's got a woody stem. If you cracked a stem, a branch a little bit, you could see that it has multiple growth on that stem year after year. Its leaves kind of have silvery green color. You can record what its flowers look like, and that can help you pinpoint that this plant is wolf willow. Okay, so with that, I'm going to end the presentation. I just kind of wanted to give you an example at the end of a practical use for some of these terms. I hope that helped you out and that these terms will be helpful to start your journey into plant ID. Thanks and have a great day.